The lights dimmed, and silence filled the studio. Two chairs sat under a single halo of harsh white light. A narrow glass table separated them, holding nothing but two trembling glasses of water. There was no audience, no applause, no background chatter, just the hum of cameras and the weight of expectation. Tonight, millions would witness an encounter designed to reveal truth, but what unfolded promised something far more volatile. Across the table, the guest adjusted in his chair with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime under lenses. His posture was rigid, his chin lifted slightly too high, a quiet declaration that this would not be a casual conversation. Facing him, the journalist, a figure trusted for decades, settled with measured calm, letting professionalism fill the space. Every gesture, every glance was calculated, designed to navigate both the words and the tension. "Thank you for being here tonight," the journalist began, voice even, controlled. "We appreciate your time." The reply was clipped, deliberate. "My schedule's tight. But important topics deserve space." The stage was set. What was meant to be a candid discussion quickly took on the tone of a duel. Each question carried weight, each answer a carefully chosen defense. The conversation teetered between diplomacy and confrontation, the invisible line separating patience from provocation stretching thinner with every passing minute. The journalist opened cautiously, asking about transition, balance, and life away from a centuries-old institution. The response was not simple reflection, but a mixture of correction and challenge. Every word reinforced boundaries. Public curiosity met personal resistance. The air vibrated with unspoken tension, the kind only high-profile figures accustomed to scrutiny could generate. Questions about family, routine, and public perception were met with controlled disdain. "We're not a reality TV couple," came the sharp reply. "People chronically underestimate us. It's insulting." The exchange hinted at a deeper theme, the disconnect between celebrity image and private reality. The audience, though unseen, was invited to witness the friction between expectation and lived experience, the subtle sparks of impatience igniting beneath polished composure. The conversation shifted to legacy and influence. The guest leaned back, dismissing symbolic power while asserting personal autonomy. Every word was an assertion of control over narrative, a clear message. Public perception would not dictate the terms. Yet, the journalist's steady presence reminded viewers that accountability, context, and probing questions were not negotiable. By the end of the first act, what began as a standard interview had transformed into a high-stakes negotiation of authority. Cameras captured the micro-moments, a smirk, a tightened jaw, a pause that hung heavy in the air. The tension was palpable, silent yet electric, promising that in the chapters ahead, patience, ego, and truth would collide in ways no one could ignore. The studio remained still, the black backdrop swallowing everything beyond the narrow circle of light. There were no distractions, no audience to soften the edges, only two figures, measured in words and posture, navigating a battlefield of perception. The conversation had shifted. What began as a controlled discussion now teetered on confrontation. The journalist leaned forward, voice steady but firm. "You've left the institution, yet people say you still live under its shadow. Critics ask, are you truly seeking privacy, or simply stepping onto another stage?" The response came sharp, almost clipped. "Privacy doesn't mean silence," the guest said, voice cold. "It means choice. And the choice is mine." The tension was immediate. Every word, every pause, carried the weight of decades of public scrutiny. The clash wasn't just about a personal story, it was about narrative control. Who owned the truth? Who decided what the public could see? Here, the stakes were as much about ego as they were about reality. Questions about advocacy, media projects, and public initiatives were met with a subtle edge of defensiveness. "I didn't trade one life for another," the guest corrected. "I evolved. Freed from centuries-old expectation, I found my own path." The words cut through the air like a scalpel, precise and deliberate. Yet the journalist remained composed, aware that tension was the currency of insight. The conversation veered toward legacy, an unavoidable topic when public memory is intertwined with family history. "Your mother's influence is cited often. How has that shaped your stance?" the journalist asked carefully, aware of the delicate line between inquiry and intrusion. The reply was immediate, almost venomous. "Stop using her as a storyline. She was human. Not a ratings hook. Not a symbol to manipulate. Every syllable carried the weight of personal grievance, the lingering shadow of past scrutiny. The audience, unseen yet omnipresent in this faceless storytelling, felt the friction. This was more than an interview. It was a confrontation between expectation and lived experience, between the public's curiosity and private truth. The journalist countered gently, probing accountability, trying to separate ego from experience. Every word you speak reaches millions. Does it ever concern you how perception may differ from reality? The guest leaned back, expression tight, tone cutting. The world wants a version of me that fits its narrative. I won't perform to comfort expectations. If honesty offends, that's their choice, not mine. In that charged silence, the camera captured more than expressions. It captured a collision of worlds. One anchored in discipline, preparation, and public trust. The other forged in scrutiny, resilience, and personal agency. The clash was subtle yet unmistakable. By the end of Chapter 2, the stage had shifted from dialogue to negotiation of power. Each question, each rebuttal, revealed the deeper struggle, the delicate balance between public interest and personal sovereignty. And as the lights flickered slightly, the audience felt the unspoken truth. This conversation was no longer about facts alone. It was about control, pride, and who would bend first. The lights above the studio flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the two chairs. Silence lingered like a charged wire in the air. What had started as measured questioning had now sharpened into something far more dangerous, an unspoken war of narratives, ego, and accountability. The journalist's voice broke the stillness, calm but edged with precision. You speak about privacy and control, yet every memoir, every documentary, every public statement keeps you in the spotlight. Critics argue it's contradictory. How do you reconcile that? The guest's gaze hardened, jaw tightening. Because the spotlight doesn't own me, he said, tone clipped, almost icy. I choose when and where it shines. That's the difference. There was a pause, weighty enough to fill the studio. Every movement, every shift in posture, became a declaration. The audience, unseen but imagined, sensed the tension crackling like static electricity. This was no longer just a conversation. It was a test of endurance, of who would yield first. Questions turned sharper, aimed at legacy and personal history. Your mother's death changed global perception of privacy and press ethics. Has that shaped your approach? The words hung in the air, carefully calibrated. The response was swift, steel under calm. Stop dragging her into every discussion, he said, voice low but cutting. She was a person, not a symbol for public consumption. Using her memory to frame my choices is disrespectful. The subtle tremor of emotion beneath the controlled exterior was undeniable. The unseen viewers felt it in every syllable, every pause. The journalist pressed on, voice steady, slicing through tension like a scalpel. People want to understand what drives you. Some hear arrogance in your tone. How do you respond to that? A bitter laugh. Arrogance? Speaking truth plainly is not arrogance. People want comfort, not honesty. Each word landed like a blow, precise and intentional. The conversation had evolved into a collision between perception and intent, between public expectation and personal agency. The studio air seemed to thicken. The journalist's next words were measured, yet firm, a challenge wrapped in calm diplomacy. If privacy and peace are your goals, why continually return to the spotlight? The guest leaned forward, eyes blazing, voice raw with frustration. Because peace doesn't mean silence. It means choice. And people misunderstand that. They've spent decades shaping a version of me that doesn't exist, twisting every word into narrative they prefer. For a heartbeat, the room held still. Cameras captured more than faces. They captured history in the making. The subtle unraveling of composure, the tension between legacy and identity, entitlement and accountability. By the end of Chapter 3, the stage had transformed entirely. What began as a polite, disciplined interview had become a battleground. Every question and answer revealed the fragility behind poise, the struggle between control and expectation, and the cost of living a life scrutinized by the world. The audience, though faceless, had witnessed the first cracks in armor, the first signs that confrontation might yet tip into chaos. The black backdrop swallowed the edges of the studio, leaving only two figures framed in a harsh, unforgiving light. The calm of earlier segments had evaporated. Silence was no longer neutral, it was tense, almost predatory. Every breath, every movement, carried the weight of decades of expectation, scrutiny, and entitlement. The journalist's tone remained even, professional, yet the questions cut sharper. You criticize the institution you left, yet everything you've built still ties back to it. Critics argue that your freedom is still defined by the monarchy you claim to reject. How do you respond? The guest's gaze hardened, voice low, controlled but frosty. Critics love to confuse influence with allegiance, he said. I'm no longer a subject of their expectations. I define my own narrative. If that threatens the comfortable assumptions of others, so be it. Every word hit like a scalpel. The tension thickened. Cameras captured more than expressions. They recorded a clash of worlds. Public accountability versus private authority, responsibility versus entitlement. The conversation shifted to legacy and memory. Your mother's life and death shaped public understanding of privacy, the journalist pressed. Do you feel your choices honor that legacy or exploit it? The response was immediate, cutting through the air. Exploit. That's a tabloid framing. My choices are mine alone. Dragging personal grief into every discussion is disrespectful. The subtle quiver beneath the controlled exterior betrayed emotion, rage and frustration simmering just below the surface. The journalist leaned forward, voice steady, almost surgical. And yet, every documentary, memoir, and interview keeps you in public view. Some argue that rejecting the spotlight while remaining visible is contradictory. How do you reconcile that? A bitter laugh echoed in the studio. Visibility is not submission. Being seen does not mean being owned. I speak on my terms. If honesty offends, that's not my concern. The room seemed to vibrate with the tension between expectation and defiance, between public demand and personal agency. The journalist pressed harder, testing composure. If accountability is central to your principles, how do you hold yourself accountable in this process? For a moment, the guest faltered, eyes narrowing. Accountability is not a public performance, he said, voice rising slightly. I will not trade my dignity to fit someone else's narrative. The studio lights flickered faintly, almost as if echoing the subtle tremor in the room. For unseen viewers, the spectacle was magnetic. Two forces colliding, neither yielding, both aware that perception and power were at stake. By the end of Chapter 4, the atmosphere had shifted from dialogue to confrontation. Questions had become challenges, and answers were shields, sometimes revealing, sometimes defensive. The audience felt the collision of ego and truth, one man defending control over his story, the other anchoring the moral and journalistic framework, neither willing to flinch first. This was more than an interview. It was a study in tension, influence, and the raw consequences of living a life scrutinized by the world while demanding autonomy within it. The tension in the studio had become almost unbearable. The soft hum of the cameras and the subtle shift of lights were the only sounds cutting through the thick, charged air. This was no longer just a conversation. It was a standoff, a battle of perception, ego, and accountability unfolding under the scrutiny of millions, unseen but imagined. The journalist's voice remained calm, almost surgical. You've spoken about control, about defining your narrative. But every public statement, every memoir, every documentary pulls you back into the spotlight. Critics say it undermines the privacy you claim to seek. How do you respond? The guest's response was swift, icy, and unyielding. Critics love to frame freedom as contradiction, he said. I do not perform for approval. I speak on my terms. That is the difference between ownership and exposure. Each word landed like a carefully aimed strike. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer. Cameras recorded more than gestures. They captured the subtle breakdown of diplomacy and composure, the fine line between controlled defiance and emotional collapse. The discussion turned to legacy, grief, and accountability. Your mother's influence is undeniable, the journalist pressed. Do you feel that your actions honor her memory or exploit it? The guest's eyes flashed, jaw tightening. Exploit. That's a narrative constructed by those who profit from pain. My choices are mine. My grief is mine. Using it for entertainment is reprehensible. The studio air thickened. The clash of morality and ego was palpable. Questions continued to press boundaries. If accountability is central, how do you hold yourself responsible for the contradictions people see? For a moment, the guest paused, shoulders tense. Accountability is personal. It's not a spectacle. I will not allow my life to be a stage for moral judgment. The words were deliberate, a final assertion of control. The journalist leaned in, calm but firm. And yet, every return to the public eye, every project, keeps you entwined with the very scrutiny you claim to reject. Why stay in a world that criticizes you so fiercely? The response was immediate, almost explosive. Because peace doesn't mean silence, he snapped. It means choice. People mistake visibility for submission, judgment for understanding. I decide when and how I engage. For unseen viewers, the moment stretched, electric and tense. The controlled facade cracked, the air vibrating with frustration and defiance. And then, the breaking point arrived. With a sharp motion, the guest ripped off the microphone, rose abruptly, and strode from the studio. The door slammed, the echo reverberating like the end of an era. The journalist remained seated, composed but visibly drained. Turning to the camera, he addressed the audience with measured solemnity. Tonight's conversation was not what we intended. It was a confrontation. A lesson in ego, accountability, and the cost of public life. The screen faded to black, leaving viewers to ponder the collision of fame, expectation, and personal sovereignty, a prince undone not by scandal, but by the contradictions of his own choices and the uncompromising lens of truth.